Hey, I'm Lee Balcom, and if you've heard me talk about many things, one of them is the fact that expectations are what get you in trouble. This is true whether you're talking about marriage, or if you're talking about happiness in life, or if you're talking about how you expect others to treat you. It's always true that expectations are a setup for us. And today I want to kind of hone in on that a little bit because there's a certain paradox that I've noticed over and over in marriages, and that is what I call the expectation-attention paradox. Expectation-attention paradox. What I basically mean by that is the higher the expectation is for what somebody's marriage is going to bring to them, to do to them, to help them with, to provide for them, whatever that expectation is, the higher the expectation, the lower the attention. The lower the attention of the marriage. So let me just kind of talk through this a little bit to see if this strikes home for you. Because what I've noticed is that many times people, when they're in trouble, part of what's going on is that they are upset that their marriage has failed them because it didn't meet some expectation they were carrying in their mind. Whether that expectation was a fair expectation or not, it doesn't matter. So let's talk a little bit about where these expectations come from. One thing that happens is that right now we are surrounded by watching either the better moments people are having or the faked moments people are having. That's social media, right? And many times over and over, you'll see these couples who are having the love of their life, right? The time of their life. They're having passion all the time, and they're on these high adventures all the time, and everything good and easy comes to them. And they're posting everywhere. And so let me tell you a little bit of secret. That's not what's going on in marriages, even those marriages. How do I know? Because I've been a part of some of those. I've had people who have been the kind of the influencers around marriage who have come to me and said, our marriage is really in trouble. And I've had politicians who have had their marriage where it's part of their sales pitch, right? Come to me and say, our marriage is in trouble. I've had the same with actors, and I've had the same with musicians and all these other people who have this persona of these great relationships where they're really struggling. And the fact is that life has lots of struggles to it, no matter how much you want a great marriage, no matter what you do, you're going to have struggles. Now let's take it a little bit further than that. We also have a built-in expectation of what marriage is going to be like, whether it's from, movies or books or people we've seen. And remember, all you're seeing from most people around you is their outward piece, not their inner piece, or as many people say, the A roll, not the B roll, not the actuality, not the back scenes. We're watching what is the polished side. And we're also watching the fantasy side in movies and books that are showing us this high expectation of how marriage is going to have you living happily ever after. I mean, that is the theme that we often see. And so when you get married and reality comes right in on expectations, you've got a problem. You've got a tension. And you can resolve it a couple of ways. One is you can go, maybe my expectations weren't really what they needed to be. Or you can keep butting your expectations into reality. This is why expectations lead to such misery. Expectations are not going to win in the struggle against reality. That just is not going to happen. And so we have some options in front of us. One is we can go, okay, my expectations, maybe they were off base. Maybe my happiness, maybe, the happily ever after never really was what marriage was about. And then you can go looking for the answer. One answer that many people choose is divorce. I married the wrong person, not I had the wrong expectations, but I married the wrong person, so they're not doing what I thought they would do. They're not bringing me what I thought they would bring you. Let me be clear. I've talked about this in kind of the myths of marriage, that marriage is not the vehicle for your happiness. Other people don't complete you. When you have struggles and difficulties, that doesn't mean it's a failure. Having to work at something doesn't mean something's wrong with it. So we have this problem, and we can resolve it by abandoning ship, by saying that person, or even marriage in general. I've heard many people say, well, marriage is an outdated idea that came along long ago. That's not the case. But if we blame it on marriage in general or the other person, we also miss the second piece of this paradox, and that is attention. Let me add in that attention is tied very closely to another word, application. Attention and application. So if we really wanted to make it a difficult phrasing, it would be that the expectation, attention, application paradox is in play. Now, here's the thing. If you want your marriage to be successful, you're going to have to put effort into it. And guess what? You know that from the rest of your life. Let me give you a couple of examples anyway. So I went to jiu-jitsu. This was, when I was turning 50, I decided if I was going to get into martial art again, I did it when I was a teenager. It was now or never. And so I wanted to do jiu-jitsu. So I showed up to jiu-jitsu class with some taekwondo in my background and some videos in my mind. And I was going, well, how hard could it be? How hard could this be? And so I walk into class confident that, I would at least not be horrible at this. I was horrible at it when I got there. And the reason is because I didn't understand how much I didn't understand. I didn't know what I didn't know. That's where we start with everything. You might have a great idea. I'm going to do this. Well, you don't even know what you don't know about that. That's the first stage of learning at any point. It's the beginner's mindset that you have to have going in. And when I finally sat there a minute and went, why should I know how to do jiu-jitsu? I've had no training. I have no experience at this. Why should I even know how to do this? There's no reason I should be naturally good at this. I'm not big on the whole naturally good at this thing. Most of the time when people are naturally good at this, they have something else that's helping them along. For instance, pickleball. I go to pickleball and somebody's pretty good. I'll often say, have you done something else that's similar to this? I played racquetball when I was a teenager, so I understood the racket a little bit, so I understood the paddle a little bit. But I've noticed that, racquetball, or maybe they played squash, or maybe they play badminton, or even table tennis, or tennis. And so they have something in their background. So they come in and they've got some piece to build off of. The same could be true in marriage. You could say, well, I've had other relationships, so I can bring some of that in. And to a limited degree, that is true. Limited degree. So bear with me a little bit. So I go to jiu-jitsu, and what I realize is I just don't even understand, don't know it. And there's one way I could solve it. Well, there are two ways I could solve it. I could just go, forget it. I'm not going to work on this. Or I could say, I'm going to keep coming to class. I'm going to keep learning at it. And so as I did that, as I went to class, I would learn a new technique. And as I started to learn more and more techniques, then suddenly what meshed behind it was not the techniques in isolation, but the principles that ran those techniques. I absolutely needed those techniques, but I desperately needed the pieces behind it, the principles that are behind that. Because once I had the principles in mind, the techniques were the framing of that. That's where the principles took shape. But the techniques were supported by those principles. I could tell. It became, after a while, I'd go, okay, that's not working. This particular move is not working. What am I missing? What's the technique I'm missing? But more than that, what's the principle behind that technique that is missing? And sometimes it was an angle. Sometimes it was a shift. Sometimes it was direction. Something was not at the right place. And so as I began to get a feel for the principles, even if I couldn't name them one by one, I had a certain innate sense that was beginning to develop, and then the techniques began to work better. But what if I had, for the rest of the time, gone, I should just be good at this? There's no reason for me to learn a technique. It'll just happen, right? That isn't a recipe for getting very far in anything. In jiu-jitsu, it's a good way of getting someone to choke you out or tap you out. It's just not going to get you very far when you're up against somebody who does have a knowledge base, who does understand how things work, who does get the principles. Because once I was getting the principles, then I could kind of move from technique to technique in a way that was impromptu, but effective. If I was just going, oh, that technique didn't work, I'll try another technique, I was putting together pieces that I didn't necessarily know how they went together, right? So that's what we're talking about. So what is attention? Well, that means that you think through what's going on in your relationship. You look for how to work on things. One of the myths that often comes up is if we have to work on this, if we have to work at this, then something is wrong here. But we don't apply that in pickleball, in any hobby you have probably, at work, anywhere else in life. But suddenly, somehow, it's supposed to be different in a marriage. And then we say, well, if it's right, it'll just work. That is so far from the truth. So far from the truth. And so part of what we got to be willing to do is to say, you know what? I need to spend some time figuring out what's behind this, finding the principles behind this, learning how this works. Because marriage is unlike any other relationship in your life. You've committed yourself through whatever good or bad day comes your way, through whether there are resources or not, to do whatever for the rest of your life, to stay with this person, to wed your future together, to pull it together, and do that for the rest of your life. That's the vows. And because of that, there's room for development and room to create what I refer to as being a we, unless you keep dodging it, thinking to yourself, this should be easier than it is. Why am I having to work so hard at this? Why isn't my spouse making me happy? Why doesn't this just come to us? That's the expectations getting in our way, especially when those expectations is it should just work. Over the years, as I was working with people for premarital counseling, and I saw many, many people come through my office, every couple felt like those statistics on marriage and divorce did not apply to them because they had it right. They had the real love. Sure, their parents weren't successful, or their aunt and uncle or whoever else, or their friends or siblings or someone else out there didn't have a successful marriage, but that was because they didn't have the right love. We do. I heard it over and over. Oh, we got this. Oh, we got this. And I would start inquiring. In some ways, I was almost trying to pick an argument to get them to see that there were some deficits in their understanding that needed some filling in. They needed some attention. The higher the expectation, the lower the attention, over and over. So part of what I appreciated was when somebody said, yeah, we're concerned about what happens in our future, because then they were willing to add some attention to it. Their expectation was not so high. Then they were willing to put attention to it. Now, what does that mean, attention, right? I've talked about this many times, and sometimes people go to an extreme. I remember years ago, I was doing a marriage meeting, a conference, and so we were at this location, and this woman, I could tell, was not buying what I was saying. She was neatly dressed, had on a little tennis skirt, and just was really put together, but I could see her arms were crossed, and she was shaking her head at me when I was talking about the need that you need to focus on your relationship, because what often happens is, as I've talked about in another video, you hit the pause button, right? You hit the pause button and you think, I'll come back to this relationship down the road and it'll be okay, because we kind of put it in suspended animation until the kids get so old, the hobbies get done, the work gets done, whatever it is that caused you to hit the pause button. Then when you come and unpause it, you realize that it really wasn't on pause and now it's on life support. And because of that, I was talking about how we unpause or need to unpause the relationship and give it some attention. And she was shaking her head at me. And I finally said, so are there any questions? And I was looking directly at her, knowing that she had a question. She said, so how much time are you expecting me to give my spouse? I can't be all about the marriage 24/7. I've got other things to do. I've got committees I'm on and interests I have, and the kids need my attention, all that. And so I asked her a simple question. I'm assuming you play tennis, am I correct? And she said, yes. And in fact, she said, I have been a competitive tennis player since I was in high school, and I still am. I said, okay. And she said, don't you think you're taking my tennis from me? That was not my intention. I wanted to, set a trap. And so I said to her, how much do you practice? I mean, you're good at tennis, obviously. You're competitive, so how much do you do? And she said, well, I practice, 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week. I'm like, okay, 2, 3, 4 times a week for a day at a time or an hour or two at a time? She said, oh, probably usually an hour, hour and a half at a time. So, okay, so hour and a half at a time. And that keeps you in tune, correct? She said, yes. And I said, were there times when things weren't going so well that maybe you went to tennis camp or did a longer series? She said, oh, yes, just to kind of make that next jump. And I said, I think you're going to find marriage a lot like that. You don't have to be with your spouse 24/7 to have the attention given to it. But that also doesn't mean that you're just sitting in front of the TV together or sitting on your phones together or in the same room or in the same house together. That's not attention. That presence might help a little bit, but it's not attention. Attention means that you actually focus on each other a little bit. That when you have a problem, you decide you're going to work through that problem. When you don't know how to work through a problem, you find some source to do that. You read a book, you go to a conference, you talk to a therapist or a coach, or you do something to help fine-tune you. And I could see that the lights were coming on for her because the trap was set. She was very good at tennis, going 2, 3, 4 times a week for an hour at a time because she kept it sharp. She kept her skills sharp. Now, I found the same to be true at jiu-jitsu. There was a certain point when I could go too often during the week and my body would pay for it. I was running through what was possible. And the same in a relationship, right? You got to have some outside stuff coming in to feed the relationship. But if you're never feeding the relationship, that's the real danger. You're never feeding the relationship, or you're feeding the relationship the same bad stuff over and over. That's not what I mean. So attention doesn't mean you have the same fight on repeat, never solving it. Attention means that you have loving attention that's meant to be constructive for your relationship, to learn new skills, to show attention to the relationship in a loving way. So that's the paradox. And it's a paradox that you can solve pretty easily. It takes 2 things. If your expectations are too high, to find realistic expectations, not based on what somebody's putting on social media or not based on what you're seeing on TV from, some famous person who says they have a great marriage and then you watch it fall apart. We've seen that time and again, right? Or you're watching the happily ever after and going, I wish I had that kind of love. You know how you have the happily ever after? You work on it on a regular basis. So we get to our expectations where we expect the marriage to work because we bring our attention to it, our commitment to it, and learn new skills, which is when we bring the attention to it. So I want you to notice that paradox, right? If your expectations are way up here and your attention is way down here, you're in trouble. That doesn't mean you trash and expect nothing or expect only bad stuff and that you have to have 24/7 attention to it. But that you find a place where your attention and your application towards your marriage is feeding the relationship and your expectations aren't out of control. That's how you solve the paradox. And that's how you find a great marriage. You build it. It's not finding a new person. You build the great relationship, a skill at a time, attention at a time, practice at a time. If you're not sure how to do that, come visit me, savethemarriage.com. That's savethemarriage.com. This is Lee Balcom wishing you the best as you work to build and give attention to saving your marriage.